Hi, welcome to the CyberTAP podcast. I'm George Bailey, your host, and my co-host with me.
Hey, I'm Jim. I asked the dumb question so you don't have to, and I think today that's going to be especially clear. We also, and I will throw it out there for the listening audience, we are missing producer Eric, and so we are fumbling through this in spectacular fashion.
What we do for our listeners. So, how you been, Jim?
Good. Went to, we were just talking pre-show, family and I went to Covered Bridge Festival in Indiana this weekend. And for those who don't know, it is a staple of Indiana culture to attend Covered Bridge Festival. And we just found out that Phil, our distinguished guest today, has not been.
Yeah, it's the largest festival in Indiana. Phil, you got to go next year.
I do hope to go sometime, yeah. Sooner than later.
I was telling the guys before the show that estimated 2 million visitors over the course of a week. And I completely believe it. I mean, it's borderline shoulder to shoulder, especially the first weekend of it, which was this past weekend. And they've done a pretty good job of wrangling in the crowd. It used to be, it's in this tiny little town. I don't even know what the population is, but they would let cars still drive through there, which was insane. That cars and pedestrians would be going through, and they've stopped the cars, which is good. And even though the show's bigger, they've wrangled in the types of booths. So it used to be a lot of just cheap Chinese junk that people are reselling, flea market style, but they've really reined it in a little bit. So it's mostly
a lot of handcrafts.
Yeah, a little more crafty stuff, local artisans, food, tons of food. So yeah, good time.
Yeah, it's the largest festival in Indiana, in rural Indiana. So
yeah,
it's amazing they get that many people in such a small place.
Yep.
But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today's podcast is going to be an update on the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It's the DoD's U.S. Department of Defense's means to better secure their supply chain. And as you know, we have on our panel today, we have Phil Conrad, who is an information security analyst here at CyberTAP. He is also a CMMC certified auditor, first one on the team. How did that go, Phil?
CMMC certified assessor, yes, it went well. I made it through the exam. The exams, there's two. You got to get the CMMC certified professional first and then pass that exam. Once you get that, you can become, you can take the training and take the CMMC certified assessor exam. It was hard. It was, they gave me 4 hours to take the exam, and I used about 3 hours and 55 minutes.
So both exams took 4 hours each, or
I think each was 4 hours. I kind of forget the first one, but
who administers? Who's the
CyberTAP is the organization that's sort of in charge of the CMMC ecosystem.
Okay.
And so they administer the program.
But it's a proctored exam, correct? Like at Pearson or one of those other testing centers.
Yep. It is. It was at a testing center, and so it's a little bit stressful with all that goes into it. And
were you by yourself, or was it like a group of?
I was by
peers?
myself. Yeah.
Okay.
There was a couple of the folks in the testing center, of course, but it was just Well, there was about 20 of us that went through the training, and then it's up to you to take the exam whenever you want to, whenever you feel like you're ready.
So was it like one-on-one proctored, like somebody just sitting there staring at you the whole time, or was it somebody come and check on you every once in a while?
It was a testing center, and so there was like just a room full of computers and cameras and.
Gotcha. You're under video surveillance.
Yeah.
You got a handprint before you can come in and out of the room. Show ID.
Yeah. Proctor has to come in and set your computer up for you, and so it's just limited to what you can what you can access and stuff. So. Yeah, it's you're kind of restricted to, you get a piece of paper and a pencil, I think, and it's what I got to make a paper.
How would you say it compared to some of your traditional security certifications that you've earned?
I would say I would say maybe a little bit more stringent, a little bit more difficult. It was a higher degree of difficulty than I anticipated, and one of the ways I like to try to prepare for these exams is through practice questions. Practice exams and quizzes, and I found the questions on the actual exam a little bit, or maybe a little bit more difficult, in some cases a lot more difficult than I would have expected. And
well, and this is a new certification, so it's not like there's years and years and version after version of test banks that you can kind of review to
Right.
get the rigor or even the mindset you've got to be in.
Yes. And so each question required a lot of like thought. I had to like think through and understand exactly what the question was asking. So yeah, it was challenging. So I was very relieved to pass that exam. But
Was the training more in regards to how to conduct an assessment, or did it go into helping you understand what the controls meant and did, like as a from a cybersecurity practitioner?
yeah, I think a lot of it, from my experience, was from a practitioner. I think in terms of like these are the controls, and the trainers would share experiences that they had in doing assessment work and how they understood controls, and we had a lot of good discussion in our class among our the other classmates that were part of it that also had experiences and stuff. So that discussion helped a lot, and the training was good. Obviously, good enough to help me get through the exam. But yeah, like you said, it's just there's just not a great test bank of questions. So, and it's hard to. In my mind, it's hard to take the exam and then think about creating test questions, for practices.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a high stakes exam.
Yeah.
Right. And there's only a few hundred certified assessors, so there's not a lot of people who
maybe
can tell their
300.
story.
Yeah.
Who the others can learn from.
Right.
Eventually, when we have thousands of them, and we have, social media influencers telling people how they got through
Right.
it, and then the rest of us will be better prepared, or at least have the ability to be prepared. So, let's remind our users what CMMC is. Right. It's a program from the Department of Defense to secure the confidentiality of controlled unclassified information. So CUI. If you receive CUI from a DoD prime program office, you likely will have to become certified at some level. There are 3 levels. At level 2, there's 110 controls, and those controls map directly to the NIST 800-171 revision 2. There is a revision 3 of that standard out, but DoD has made a decision to keep the certification at level 2 because we've been, or at revision 2, because of the whole training of the ecosystem. And there is a significant difference between the 800-171 reversion 2 and reversion 3 standards. So eventually, they'll probably slowly adopt revision 3 at some point. But if you receive CUI, as of today, the Federal Register update for the CMMC program should be published, which means in 60 days, you'll be able to reach out to a third-party certifying C3PAO, a third-party certified. Go ahead, Phil.
Certified third-party assessment organization.
There you go. That's a mouthful.
Everything's a mouthful. It's all acronyms and it's hard to keep track of all of them.
Yeah, you thought
sometimes.
acronyms and information security, cybersecurity was bad. You add yet another accreditation route, and it just gets worse.
And so today's October 14th. I don't know when this is going to get released, but when George says today, it's October 14th. So if you're just hearing this.
Yeah, so we actually anticipate it being published on the 15th, early this week.
Yeah.
I didn't check right before. It wasn't as of this morning, but and if you are tracking, it is the 32 CFR Part 170 is where the CMMC program rule is. And what that rule is meant to do is to help support and build the assessing and auditing ecosystem, right? Just because the CMMC program ecosystem exists doesn't mean you are yet going to be required to get a certification, right? That rule comes out later this year, and it's going to be in 48 CFR Part 204. And that's the piece where if you have DoD contracts today, you likely have what the industry refers to as the DFARS Clause 7012. And that clause dates back to 2012 when, as an organization, you would have attested to being compliant or embracing the NIST 800-171 standard, that you are managing any sort of the gaps from that standard on a POAM, a plan of action and milestone, another acronym. And you have an incident response capability, meaning if you had an incident involving CUI, you could detect it, contain it, eradicate it, and recover from that, while also having the obligation to notify the DoD of that incident. Those are the requirements. Those are the requirements as of right now. That's the rule of the land. So the certification came around because organizations were either not very good at self-assessing. Some organizations don't even know about NIST 800-171. So they've onboarded work with the DoD. They've accepted these contractual clauses, but they have no idea that they've obligated themselves to this level of security.
I've got a question for you. So what are the chances that somebody listening right now would know or not know if this is applicable to them or their company? I mean, would you know at this point if it applies to you or not? Or could there be people out there listening that are going, assuming there are people listening, saying, oh man, I wonder if this applies to me? Is there a way they look? Like how?
There's
how
a
do you-
couple
how
of
do you hit
different
that
ways,
threshold?
and I'm definitely interested in Phil's response, but I think the way that I counsel clients, either they're getting communication from their primes, right? Typically there'd be a tier 2 or tier 3 contractor. They're making a widget, they're making part of a larger assembly, they're heat treating something, they're coding something. And so they're getting information on the specifications of the part or their piece of the work from an upstream contractor. And if that upstream contractor hasn't flowed down requirements, so part of the CMMC requirements are if you receive CUI and as part of your contract with the DoD and you sub some of that work out, if you have to share CUI with that task order, you have to flow down those requirements. So in your contracts with your subcontractors, it should stipulate that they need to do.
So the chance of it not trickling down is pretty slim at this point.
Well, I think in the future it's going to be much better. Part of the problem today is that for any of these obligations to kick in, you have to have CUI. How do you know if the part that you're making for, let's say, the Black Hawk helicopter, which also has a commercial application, right? Maybe you're making a tail wing on the propeller or a part of that. It has a commercial and aviation opportunity, but it also has, it's going to land its way in a defense product. Your prime sends you the schematics. It's not marked. It's not marked CUI. How do you know, right? For something to be CUI, it has to be marked. However, there's lots of legacy data out there, and DoD's bad about marking, primes are bad about marking. At some point when everyone has to be certified and they're all going to be graded on how they're marking media and CUI, the problem will eventually resolve itself. But at the moment, you could be receiving CUI, thus having to be compliant with the DFAR 7012 clause and not even know it.
Not know that the schematic you're looking at is something you shouldn't be looking at or something you should
something
be
that is
protecting.
sensitive and you need to protect.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Phil, and what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I think if you're in the defense industrial base, you probably have some knowledge or familiarity with the CMMC program. Have probably by now heard about it on some level. Like you mentioned, if you have a contract that you're trying to execute for an upstream customer, then you maybe have had that in your contract. I know I've worked with some smaller businesses across the state that was their situation. They received something that said, you need to be at CMMC level 1, for example, and so and that's kind of what prompted them to engage to seek out assessment for that. So yeah, I think most, especially if you are, have done work with the DoD. There are some businesses that may be seeking to get into the space of contracting with DoD, and so they're looking into this as well. But yeah, so it's likely that most, I think, have heard about it.
Yeah, and there's so CUI, controlled unclassified information, is categorized by the National Archives, and there's lots of data that is categorized as CUI. Your Social Security number, for instance, is considered CUI. Your health records is considered CUI by the National Archives. And there was an executive order early on in I want to say Biden's administration, but it might have been in Obama's, that CUI has to be protected, right? So regardless of where you receive it from the federal government. So at some point, other agencies, DHS is looking at a CMMC program, Department of Ed is looking at a CMMC-like program. So if you're a university listening to the podcast and you take financial aid, guess what? At some point, Division of Financial Aid might require that your university protects financial aid data per a CMMC certification. DHS was still at its proposal rule stage. They were still looking at self-assessments. But just like the DoD had started out with self-assessments in 2012, they reversed that and started doing this third party, so it's hard to say what will happen. If there's ever a modification to the HIPAA security rules, HHS, Health and Human Service, might require a CMMC type certification because CUI is data that is sensitive, confidential, not necessarily going to produce significant harm to the nation if they were disclosed, but it's things that the federal government wants us to protect.
Yeah. So, I mean, is the hope that the work that's being done through the Department of Defense network going to be the blueprint for those others? Is that
and that's
kind of
why
the
there's
idea?
the two rules. There's the 32 CFR that creates the CMMC ecosystem that builds up the governance of the accreditation body, what a CMMC certification maps to on the standards side, who's allowed to do it, and then other agencies can start to develop acquisition rules that would use that program.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was interesting. As I continued to learn more about all the the rules and different things, there's a lot of organizations that have their kind of hands into this thing. So the 32 CFR, or Code of Federal Regulation, is owned by the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. The 48 CFR, as I understand, is owned by the Office of the Secretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment. The DoD CUI is owned by Office of Secretary of Defense Intelligence and Security. And then the other item that was talked about was specific decisions about data criticality is owned by the Office of Secretary of Defense Research and Engineering. So there's different units within Secretary of Defense and then the Department of Defense CIO that own different parts of of all that goes into the CMMC. And so it's easy to kind of get lost into what you're looking for and where to find it and how to get more information about it. But yeah, so I try to put that all in kind of a little table and to help me kind of like frame what goes where and who has what. And
well, I think that's I just looking at, I can see your table from here, and I think part of the concern too is how complex it seems to be, because as long as I've been doing industry outreach, CMMC has been part of the conversation, and I know there's just as much confusion on the outside as there seems on the inside of just the complexity of it, what needs to be done first, in what order, when's it going live. And I think, if we had one topic today, I think this is going to be a bigger conversation and into multiple episodes, but if we had one topic today of, hey, where do we start, with you being an assessor, what is the jumping off point? I mean, it sounds like people, or I should say companies, already are aware, like, hey, this is going to affect us, or we are probably in the line of sight for this thing. But what is the next step or the first step I mean, I know people have been working on it for years now, but what is the next logical step in this?
I would say, Jim, that the next logical step, particularly if you are new to understanding where you are in your CMMC journey, right? So if you believe that you have CUI, have a conversation with your customers. Get a sense of, are they sending you sanitized data, right? And if there's any belief that you have CUI, then you should do a readiness assessment, right? And I would say call on a partner to do that. Every organization has some internal biases, and sometimes it's hard, right? Because every company that I've worked with over the years, many of them are family-owned businesses. That their grandfather, their great-grandfather started the business. They were patriots, very passionate, right? They understand what they're doing in the products that they're building, in the missions that they serve.
Right.
They're not cybersecurity professionals. So when you are presented a standard, 110 controls across 14 control families, 120 different attributes that are going to be looked at to determine if you meet those 110 controls, that is hard. And you might say, as you go through your checklist or your inventory of the controls, yes, we have access controls in place, right? Because my entire workforce can fit in a school bus.
Mm-hmm.
I know my workforce's grandkids. I trust them. I have locks on my doors. We have passwords. We have access control.
Mm-hmm.
That may not be good enough,
right,
in the way of defining and showing evidence that you've met all of the 21 controls under the access control family.
Right.
So having someone who can guide you through what these controls are, what the language means, what's good enough, what isn't good enough, that's important. Because if you've done it yourself, and if you're not hard on yourself, and the DIBCAC assessment, so DIBCAC is DoD's auditing agency. So when a tier 1 prime or a high priority supply chain prime needs to be audited, DIBCAC does that.
Mm-hmm.
So
That
all
would be-
level 3 assessments will be
level
done by
3.
DIBCAC, right? So it won't be a third party, it'll be the government assessing you. So right now you can get a joint surveillance audit or an assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is you have a C3PAO and DIBCAC assessing you at the same time. The idea is we can give C3PAOs experience and observations
Mm-hmm.
supervised and shadowed by a DIBCAC assessor who's been doing them for years to help build the C3PAO, that body of corporate assessors. Well, the idea is you can get a joint surveillance audit now, right? So I'm not sure what the waiting list is, but you can sign up for one, you can request one, and DIBCAC and C3PAO, likely if you're choosing, will come, assess you, and if you have gaps or deficiencies, right, you could be given a conditional certification, assuming you have a score of 80 or higher, and you have no high priority safeguards unchecked, right? So when you look at those 110 controls, they have priorities either 5-point penalties, 3-point penalties, or 1-point penalty. And for every gap that you have, you would minus those points from 110.
Okay.
So if you have a score of 80 or higher and you have no 5 or 3 deficiencies,
Mm-hmm.
then you can get a conditional certification for 180 days.
Okay.
Gives you time to go back for those low-hanging, low-priority controls to fix them, get reassessed, and get your certification. The benefit of having a joint surveillance audit now would be as soon as the DFARS 48 rule comes out, or CFR comes out, and you now have to be certified to a certain level, if you had your joint surveillance assessment 6 months ago, your 3-year certification window starts
Mm-hmm.
as soon as that becomes a requirement.
So I had a question, and it's kind of evolved now. But because you mentioned mom and pops, and maybe aren't fully aware of cybersecurity risks and whatnot. And my first question was, I've been in hundreds of manufacturers, I think, over the years, and I would say very few of them have cybersecurity as a priority.
Sure.
Maybe not even top 5, probably not top 10.
It's not a competency.
Right.
For sure.
And a lot of the IT that they're using is outdated. It's old. And my initial question was going to be, what is the cost for these initial assessments? But then the likelihood of them being deficient is high. So what about the financial cost then of putting in all of and whatever remediation is required? I mean, that could be significant, and what is the plan for tackling that? Because, I think the idea and the mission of CMMC is good. I think it's good that we are aware of our supply chain to that extent. But financially, what is that going to do to companies that are already on possibly razor thin margins that now have to spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars just to make sure that they are compliant? Is there leeway for that? So, like I said, my question involved, is there leeway for, that expenditure? Like, hey, all right, we understand this is going to cost you $200,000 to get square, but we'll give you a grace period to work up to it so you don't have to spend that overnight. But then also, like, what is the financial, at least the upfront of like an assessment? You're talking about a couple different avenues here. What is that initial assessment cost typically?
Good question. Any ideas, Phil? I've got some ideas.
I don't know. All the I mean, it's a lot. I think thousands and thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, if not maybe hundreds.
Just for the assessment piece.
Just for the assessment.
Right.
Okay.
The assessment.
In the most recent rule, the program rule, 32 CFR Part 170, they do provide a table of estimates.
Okay.
And for that level 1, right? So level 1 is an organization that does not receive CUI. They receive FCI, federal contract information, which is less sensitive. Basically, you're doing business with the DoD, and the details of your contractual relationship is private. 15 controls, right? Basic cyber hygiene. Most organizations will likely have most of that in place. They might have to do some documentation to formalize their operational practices, but it's generally a pretty low barrier to entry. So they're claiming that the self-assessment of that, because that's the only thing that's required, and then the annual reattestation of that is a few $1,000s a year.
Okay.
Right. The level 2 assessment is it's over 6 figures. It's over, so I think 104,000 is what I saw on the table, and that is to do the assessment, prepare for the assessment, do the assessment, and do the documentation. Right. So you're attesting, you're uploading the results to the PI and the risk performance.
And that's what they're
systems.
estimating.
They're estimating, and then a level 3, they're estimating about $13,000, because that's in addition to a level 2.
Okay, so the level 2 is really the meat.
Level 2 is the meat. That's going to be the majority of CUI holders. And then level 3, which would be either the high risk, either weapon systems or product that is, could jeopardize the warfighter or weapon system.
Right.
Those would be a level 3, and it's another $13,000 on top of the $100,000.
It's like ordering a pizza and then getting extra cheese. It's
yeah,
just a little bit.
Exactly what it is, right?
Got to pay for that extra cheese.
Yeah, they do charge you for it.
And I will tell you, we've done readiness work for many small to medium sized businesses in Indiana, and I don't think any of them are going to be able to ante up $100K unbudgeted. Right? They're going to have to work into that. And DoD says you can build that into your pricing for your product, but supply chains are competitive. Right? If I've got to add somehow up my price on a widget to cover $100,000, and I have to do that every 3 years, am I going to be competitive? I don't know.
Does the DoD?
That's the fear.
Yeah, but do they care? They'll pay for it. So who's going to end up paying for it?
Some supply chains, that are maybe there aren't as many quality providers.
Yeah.
DoD will eat that cost. But
which means the taxpayer will eat that cost.
Yeah.
Right.
But for for something like, machining or CNC, where, if you've got AS 9100 standards and you're certified to ISO, and someone else can do it faster and cheaper,
Right.
that are already certified, they're going to win the business.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
But at the same time, by dropping the hammer, you're going to cripple your own supply chain.
been a fear. So,
By everybody then grinding to a halt so they can be certified. Because think 10 years from now, okay, then it's just going to be the new people coming on that need it. But when you drop that hammer the first time, everybody's going to come screeching to a halt if they aren't already working down that path. I mean, I know companies have been talking and working on this for years, so I think a lot of people are ahead of that game. But there's still always that. Are we ready for it?
and because of that, there is the phase-in program. So for this first year, so 2025, when contracts are allowed to have that DFAR CMMC certification level requirement in it, they anticipate 135 supply chains are going to need to be certified. And then it goes up several hundred the next year, a couple thousand the year after, and by year 3, year 4, it's everybody that receives CUI. So another thing with the updated DFARS rules that we're still waiting on is they're bifurcating level 2. There's going to be some low organizations that get less risky CUI, and they won't have to get a third-party certification. They can do the internal assessment themselves. Now, they have to be compliant to all the same requirements. They just won't have to go out and pay that $100,000 to have someone come in and say, yes, you are doing this. Right?
So there's like a level 2 self-assessment. There's also a level 2 C3PAO assessment.
Yes.
So I was wondering about that too. Like, is that going to be something stated in a DoD contract? Like, this is the contract, you need to have at least a level 2 self-assessment. And then you kind of like get the,
I think so, because
opportunity to do
it's
that.
the program office, it's the DoD that's going to be establishing the requirements for the primes and all the subcontractors that they identify as part of that product.
Right.
So if you share CUI to your subcontractors, the DoD is going to already tell you they're going to have to be at this level. And maybe that's negotiable. Maybe you say, well, we use this facility for heat treating, but we don't share any data with them. They just have the part. And physical parts are not CUI, even though you could, scan them and make 3D models of them and probably reverse engineer this. A physical part is not CUI. So it'll be interesting how that plays out, because again, in the most recent 32 CFR rule that builds the CMMC program, they equate to something like 8,500 level 2 certifications, which is far smaller. So originally, we were being told it's like 80,000 organizations of the 300,000 organization DIB. Right? If it's gone from 80,000 to 8,500, that's probably way more manageable on at least the assessing side, where the C3PA is having to get in front of all of these people. Because to keep in mind, these are likely 40-plus hour assessment engagements. So if how many are there? 60 C3POs right now?
Roughly 60, yeah. I think the last count I heard was 57. So
if there's 60 organizations and they have to assess 80,000 organizations every 3 years, better get in line. There's going to be a wait period to get your assessment done. But if it's 8,500, that might be a little bit more palatable. But to your first question, Jim, you asked, how much is this thing going to cost? So the assessment is one thing. That's going to be expensive. That's going to be something that you engage a consulting partner with, and just like any other professional services, you're going to time and materials, right? But it's not a certification and forget it. It's a 3-year renewable certification. So for 3 years, all the processes that you've established to get to that initial certification, you have to live and fulfill those, right? So things like monitoring your environment, responding to incidents, doing vulnerability assessments, doing risk analyses, doing all these things that is going to take a human resource capacity out of, right? So if you don't have an IT team yet, you're either going to have one or you're going to have to outsource that, because you might
say they list in that 32 CFR that you need to have an affirming official who affirms your. So once you get your assessment done, that's one thing, but then you have to affirm that assessment is still, meeting the requirements every year, and then again that third year, then you'll need that assessment again.
Correct. And I would imagine for the small to medium, that could be a president, that could be, VP of engineering, someone who is knowledgeable enough about processes and product to say, none of our controls have significantly changed. There's no been meaningful, we're still compliant to our system security plan that we developed for initial certification is still applicable today. But that 3-year, right? So let's just take vulnerability assessment because it's a commodity service you can get from a lot of MSPs, a lot of security providers will, and you pick your own, destiny, right? So if you as an organization decide we're going to do vulnerability assessment every 3 months, once a quarter, I, as a security practitioner, might tell you that's not frequent enough. But if you're willing to live with that level of risk, you can do it every quarter. But if you don't go out and procure the software and have the resources to run that software, look at the reports, remediate the findings to prepare for the next quarter, then it's going to be dog chasing his tail, right? You're never going to get caught up. And if you were to hire an MSP, they're going to charge you anywhere from, a few dollars to several $1,000s every time they scan, right? And then they're going to charge you to remediate. So if you scan your environment and you find out that 25 of your computers are missing a particular software patch, well, hopefully in this process you've developed some automated or efficient patching strategies. But if you haven't, guess what? You're going to be paying someone to come and patch your environment if you don't have those resources. So the program is meant to really raise your maturity,
but also snowball a little bit. It sounds like.
Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot to do. So picking how you run your program, some of it might be completely up to you, but knowing what the best cadence for certain processes that really do decrease your risk, but doesn't break your bank, right? So do you need top secret DoD level security? Probably not. But do you want entry level basic security? No. Finding out where you are that's why that readiness assessment, so you can get in front of someone who can help you get a better idea of these safeguards. Anything else we should talk about on this topic?
Man,
of CMMC?
I mean, I think so. You said this is, within days now.
Of the first of the two rules being
finalized. October 14th. For those keeping track.
And then there's a 60-day waiting period.
So I think this will definitely warrant a revisited conversation, and maybe we can pull in some other friends of the show to talk about it. We'll bring Phil back and kind of unpack it once it's out there in the wild. Because I've still got tons of questions, but I don't know that we got time to handle it today. So I would say then to everybody listening, if you have questions, reach out to us, because we can maybe field some of these questions in our next episode on the topic.
Absolutely.
You can reach us on our email, cybertap.podcast@purdue.edu, and then the CyberTAP on all of our socials, or cyberTAP, I think, as well. So, but let us know your questions. Maybe we can field some of those on the next episode and kind of prep some discussion around real world issues. But on that, I think we'll call this one done, and then revisit it here in the near future.
Sounds good. Until next time.
Thanks,
Thank you
Phil.
for listening.